The truth of the matter is, I'm not entirely sure what Huma Abedin is doing. Hillary Clinton has said that she has a very important and sensitive position in her personal office where she serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff. What we simply are doing is trying, Andrea, to connect the dots. We have a woman who, as we explore at length in Part 8 of the course, has family associations, father, mother, brother, with prominent people in the Muslim Brotherhood, or in the case of her mother, sisterhood. We are looking at a whole host of activities in Part 9 of the course in which the State Department is engaged that fairly clearly track with the preferences of the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not in a position to tell you. We don't have, subpoena power. We don't have access to classified information. We don't have the ability to call them up for congressional hearings. We know some people who do. But I think this is a perfect question to be posed. There is a person with close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood sitting at the right hand of the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State just gave, for example, $1.5 billion tax dollars to the Muslim Brotherhood, now running the government of Egypt. Is that cause and effect? I don't know, Andrea, but I hope somebody will look into it, because whether she personally is responsible for this or not, I don't know. Whether other people in the State Department, for example, that unnamed State Department official who's delighted that there's now going to be an embrace of legitimate Islamism, is responsible, I don't know. But I think this is the kind of question that we ought to be asking officials at the State Department as well as in the White House. We start the course by making the point that the problem, as I think I've tried to indicate here, is with Sharia. It's with adherence to a doctrine that commands the replacement of any other form of government with one that conforms to Sharia. That is anti-constitutional, to say the least. We are very pleased that at this moment, at least, in America, and I think elsewhere around the world, there are millions of Muslims who don't want to live under Sharia, don't know what Sharia is, aren't seeking to impose it on anybody else. I think, in fact, most Americans, not all of them, most American Muslims came here to get away from Sharia. So far from making a widespread allegation that any Muslim who serves in the United States government is a problem, we're making the point that hopefully they all fall into that category of people who do not embrace, who do not subscribe to, who do not seek to advance or impose Sharia. I don't know for sure, personally, whether Huma Abedin does. She's married a Jew. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. But all I'm saying is, to go back to your last question, I think, in the Cold War, it was enough to get you excluded from the country, let alone from public service, if you were associated with a communist, let alone if you had 3 family members who are, under the model that we're offering here, communism with a God, their counterparts. So again, I hope it will not be seen as slander. I hope it will be seen as a legitimate inquiry that is long overdue, because frankly, there's a lot of this going on. And what we've tried to do by just looking at 6 individuals in influential positions, some of them on government payroll, some of them in advisory capacities, is that when, as we showed at the beginning of that overview, you're just a regular American. And you're wondering, why are things going so badly in this war? Whether it's that you're being put through a strip search at the TSA line, or you're hearing somebody explain that that guy who shot up people in Fort Hood wasn't a terrorist. That's the kind of thing, Andrea, I'm going to ask you indulgence, you come back to you, but if anybody else has any questions, I'll take those. Okay, well, I'll come back to you, but I just want to finish this one thought. To the extent that we ignore some of these dots, let alone systematically avert our gaze from basically any of them, I suggest to you we are making it exceedingly unlikely, if not utterly impossible, for us to prevail against an enemy that we have every reason to believe, on the basis of their own documents and a lot of other evidence in the public domain, is actively using civilization jihad, including penetration of our government, to destroy us from within by our own hands. You have, I think, a peculiar set of circumstances that seem to have triggered a reasonably recent substantial breakthrough for the Muslim Brotherhood front groups in America. A fellow by the name of Mohammed El-Biari, who was one of the folks in the picture and who we drilled down on, a very prominent Islamist activist out of Texas, who now is on the Homeland Security Advisory Committee, who is also on the Homeland Security Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. In which capacity, by the way, he, I think, has played a very important role in what you're asking about, so let me come back to that. But prior to that, as we document in the course, again, perhaps just coincidence, but he went to Quantico to receive an award from the FBI, which has its academy there, for service rendered to the countering violent extremism effort. And almost immediately thereafter, like within 2 days or so, a fellow by the name of Spencer Ackerman, who writes for Wired magazine, published a very virulently critical article, first of a number of them, denouncing the FBI for having in its library at the Quantico Academy documents that were offensive to Muslims in their training materials, and photographs taken by a cell phone turned up to accompany the article. Well, within hours, I think it was, certainly not many days, you had the Muslim Brotherhood light up these various front groups that they identified themselves as their organizations or organizations of their friends, and several that came into being after that 1991 memorandum was prepared. And they took the Justice Department, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the government to task that these kinds of hateful materials, offensive materials, blasphemous materials under Sharia were part of the training curriculum of the FBI. And that set in train a whole series of things, which again we try to chronicle as best we can, just again from the public domain information, that indicate that the FBI was tasked by the Justice Department to purge those files. We mentioned in the overview that the FBI director met in the end of February with a number of these Muslim Brotherhood fronts for the purpose of telling them that something on the order of 700 documents had been purged and 300 briefing materials had been purged, lest they give offense. Some of them, they said, were just in bad taste, but I think many of them were seen as, well, too accurate, let's put it that way, too correct in their depiction of what we're up against here, namely Sharia-adherent jihadists seeking through a variety of means, violent and nonviolent, to wage war against this country. So those are out now, and in their stead, we have guidelines that have been promulgated both by the Justice Department and by the Department of Homeland Security at the recommendation of the Countering Violent Extremism Working Group, which has actually 3 of the people we profile on it. In addition to Mohammed El-Biari, Dalia Mogahed, an advisor to President Obama, who also runs the Gallup organization's Muslim polling organization, and Mohammed Majid. Mohammed Majid may be a name known to you all. He runs the what's been described by Paul Sperry as the second most dangerous mosque in America, in Sterling, Virginia. It's called the Adams Center, the All Dulles Area Mosque Society, or Muslim Society, rather. And Muhammad Ali Biari also has another job. He is the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States. It's called the Islamic Society of North America. Don't take my word for it. It topped the list in that 1991 memorandum issued by a top Muslim brother. And found, interestingly enough, this is a sidelight that I always love to tell because it's kind of a gee whiz, that particular document, which was introduced into evidence in the 2008 Holy Land Foundation trial, was discovered providentially. It happened that in 2004, a couple was driving across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, not so far from here. And I'm sure many of you have been across that beautiful body of water, wonderful span, get up on the top, it's a great view, people often take pictures. Well, a police officer happened to notice that the woman in the car was taking pictures all right, except she was taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge. He thought that didn't look right. He pulled them over. He ran their IDs, discovered that the driver of the car, a fellow by the name of Ismail El Barassa, was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago in connection with fundraising for Hamas. That gave rise to a search warrant which the FBI executed on their home in Annandale, Virginia, half an hour from here. Searched the place top to bottom, only to discover, lo and behold, below the bottom was a secret sub-basement in which were found roughly 80 banker boxes worth of the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America, some of which were exploited for the purposes of convicting the 5 people in the Holy Land Foundation trial, including the guys who were obviously most immediately involved in Hamas fundraising under the charitable banner of that organization. My point is this, that when you look at what these guys were up to, and you look at the list that destroying Western civilization from within and the attached list that starts with the Islamic Society of North America, it just strains credulity, and I think has got to be alarming to most Americans, that we're allowing those people, the Muslim Brotherhood's senior leadership, to be on the group that actually describes, defines, and basically will furthermore limit who can do training about terrorism or violent extremism and who can't. What can be said by those people and what can't? And you put it all together, and it is really, I think, the kind of thing, as I say, that cries out for oversight, investigations, and maybe more. One of the recommendations we make in Part 10 of the course is that, yes, indeed, the Muslim Brotherhood should be listed, should be designated as a terrorist organization. Well, some people will say, well, that State Department official, for example, will say, well, we couldn't do that. They're not engaged in violence. Well, as their own phased plan, which was another document that we don't have time for there, but it is in the course, makes clear. Another document, I believe, that was found in the basement of the El Barassa home. It will get violent when it's ripe. And as you say, many of their subsidiaries, their franchises, like Hamas in Palestine, are indeed very violent organizations. And interestingly enough, we make the point that there's a precedent for designating a group that may itself be said to be nonviolent if they have subsidiaries that are violent. The MEK, which is a group that has been designated as a terrorist group for some time by the United States government involving Iran, has as a parent organization the National Council for Islamic Resistance or Iranian Resistance, I think, or Resistance in Iran, something like that, NCRI. And that parent group was designated as a terrorist group on the basis that one of its franchises was. So that seems to me to be a bare minimum. If not that, and that's something that's up to the State Department, and at the moment when they're giving $1.5 billion to Hamas's parent organization, they're probably unlikely to do that. Congress might want to look at designating them a hostile foreign power, which I think is well within their ambit to do. There are a number of parallels, and we try to develop them in the course. I mentioned, I think, in the overview, for example, that it's been called communism with a god because, in fact, it has that, religious aspect to it, which, by the way, makes it vastly more dangerous in a country like ours because, after all, our traditions, our political DNA requires us to indulge in religious tolerance of even religions that we find peculiar, to say the least. But this is not, as I said earlier, about religion in the end. This is about a political program that is very similar in its totalitarianism, in its repressiveness, in its supremacism to communism. But one other aspect which is worth mentioning, by the way, the interesting thing about the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations, and there are hundreds of them around the country. There were 29 or so back in 1991. There are now hundreds, maybe even thousands, but certainly hundreds. The Muslim Students Association, all by itself, by the way, the first of the groups that was founded in 1963, I think it was the second on that list, has something on the order of 300 chapters around the United States, on college campuses where they are engaged in dawah and proselytizing and recruitment of our kids. But you look at kind of the template of these various front organizations, and you overlay it on the kind of template of the front organizations that the Comintern and the KGB and Communist Party USA all had going here, and there's a very strong similarity, especially with respect to the division of labor. The idea that you're going to have, people going after the lawyers, you're going to have people going after the doctors, you're going to have people in the schools, you're going to have people in the media, you're going to have people working the government angle, you're going to have public relations groups and so on. The churches, most especially, as a matter of fact. We have a very important section in the course about the stealth jihad being run under the rubric of interfaith dialogue. It's arguably as toxic as any for the very reason that people who think, hey, we've got to give these folks a lot of latitude because we are religiously tolerant, they are using that in a number of different ways that's insidious. For political cover, as means of extending their influence into, in some cases, churches' facilities, which, when they open them to the use by these Islamists, wind up having them consecrated to Allah. So there are lots of parallels, and I think it's important, especially when the question occurs, are we trying to take us back to those dark days? Well, unfortunately, there are people who are taking us back to those dark days, and if we don't do at least what we did, better, hopefully, more professionally, more rigorously than we did in fighting communism, when Ronald Reagan ultimately defeated it, we'll lose this country. Well, if I may use the occasion of your question to broaden it into a couple of interesting areas. The question basically was how is Sharia being addressed in law schools? I'll address that first and then come to two other related points, if I may. One of the preeminent promoters of Sharia, non-Muslim promoters of Sharia in American, society, education for sure, and specifically in law school, is a woman you may have heard of. Her name is Elena Kagan. She created and helped foster with, I believe, proceeds from a $20 million donation from Al-Walid bin Talal, a Saudi prince who is a prime funder and enabler of the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sharia finance program, for example. And lawyers are now being trained up in how to help bring that form of stealth jihad to our country through our capitalist intravenous system. In other places, I think it's probably similarly being treated as just another way to make money and make money as lawyers, among other things. I will say one of our Team B2 members, David Yerushalmi, one of the finest legal minds in the country today, has done some stupendously important work on Sharia finance, has also developed a continuing legal education program about it as kind of a counterweight to this kind of indoctrination that's taking place in our schools. Let me just mention more broadly, one of the things that's identified in the course as another form, or another vehicle, shall we say, for stealth jihad is the schools. Where I thought you were going to go, Mel, was that we are seeing at elementary school levels, for example, in some of the curriculas, children being told they need to spend 3 weeks pretending they're Muslims. They have to adopt a Muslim name, they have to go to a mosque, do a field trip, they have to fast for a day to pretend they're doing the Ramadan thing. You know, I guess it goes without saying, but let me just say it. There isn't another religion in the United States that would get that kind of treatment, let alone for 3 weeks. So one of the concerns that we have is that there is this, you know, favoritism, special treatment, concessions, that is symptomatic of what a country that is submitting unwittingly to a stealthy form of jihad looks like. And finally, just let me pick up on something else there, because one of the things that I think is really going on here, and we're very anxious to help especially the community most immediately involved understand, is that there really is a war on women going on in this country. Only it's not, I think, about contraception and abortion. It's about Sharia being insinuated here with the help of people who think that legitimate Islamism requires it, and that getting, you know, our head around helping them, they're just doing their religious thing, in our courts, among other places, is actually to the extraordinary detriment of women. In fact, we did a study at the center last year. It's available at shariainamericancourts.com. We looked at a tiny microcosm of American jurisprudence, just 50 cases at the state appellate level, just to get a sense of whether there is a problem with Sharia in our courts. Lo and behold, we found that of those 50 cases where somebody, the plaintiff or the defendant, was trying to get the court to use Sharia to adjudicate the matter, in 27 cases, in 23 different states, the court upheld the use of Sharia. Now, perhaps the most egregious example of this was one we looked at, which was in New Jersey back in 2010. A Muslim woman would come to this country, become a naturalized citizen with her Muslim husband, sought a restraining order against him because he was systematically raping and torturing her. And the judge in the case ruled that he could find no evidence of criminal intent. The man was simply trying to practice his religion in accordance with Sharia, which, among other things, by the way, has brought us a book that I gather is selling rather well in Canada about the proper ways to beat your wife under Sharia. So this is a real problem. And to the extent that we're finding women and children especially victimized by this kind of anti-constitutional insinuation of this stuff into our courts, it's a really very malevolent threat, I think, to our society and to our freedoms. The supreme guide, they call him, is a fellow by the name of Muhammad Badi. And we believe the sequence of events was basically this. In the summer of 2010, I think it was July, in Inspire magazine, which is the glossy al-Qaeda magazine that Anwar al-Awlaki was publishing, very, very sophisticated bit of jihad, specifically designed to try to recruit people to it and give them good ideas about, for example, how to make a bomb in your mother's sink. That was one of the articles. They essentially called on the Muslim Brotherhood to get out of this stealth jihad phase and just get right into the violent phase with them, al-Qaeda. And sure enough, in I think it was September, October of 2010, the Supreme Guide, newly elected, came forward, or newly appointed at least, I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is there, came forward, Muhammad Badi, and did indeed pronounce that it was time to attack the United States and Israel as part of the jihad that they're commanded to engage in. Interestingly enough, he was suggesting that the way to do that was to go after the nations that are aligned with them, not just those two countries themselves. And sure enough, within a few months, things started sparking, didn't they? First in Tunisia, then in Egypt, then in Libya, then in Syria. And next, by the way, they've described how the kingdoms should be the target in 2012. Presumably kingdoms like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, most especially Jordan. So again, I don't know whether, others will say it's cause and effect, that the Brotherhood, which has been the principal beneficiary of the turbulence that started when some street vendor in Tunisia lit himself up and then things started unfolding subsequently elsewhere. But it's crazy. It's counterintuitive, counter-logical, counter-commonsensical to say, well, we're going to ignore the possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood, whose mission is to destroy us from within, is taking down systematically our allies in an important part of the world, and worse, for us to be helping them do it. Well, I'd like to say that I had that kind of prescience. Some of those other guys you mentioned probably did, but for me it was just sufficient that we had a lot of historical experience, and not just, by the way, with Islamists, with, Nazis, with, communists, with other totalitarians. Small numbers, let alone large numbers, of people who are organized, who are disciplined, and who are ruthless tend to prevail in circumstances like those that we were witnessing begin to play out. And usually they're smart enough, and believe me, the Muslim Brotherhood is smart enough both to engineer the opportunities and to fully take advantage of them. So it seemed to me a safe bet. Whether it's going to play out elsewhere, I don't know. I mentioned at the outset, from today's news headlines, we've got an Islamist regime in Khartoum starting a new war against Christians in the south. We have Boko Haram, a now self-described Al-Qaeda operation in Nigeria, beginning to set up the same kind of circumstances. Syria is still very much in play, but I would be willing to bet you anything that if Bashar Assad actually goes over the side, the beneficiaries will be the Brotherhood. If the little king in Jordan is the next, you can bet that it will be the Palestinians of Hamas and their friends in the Brotherhood who will take over, and so on. I wouldn't want to speak for any of them, Andrea. I think there are people who have already, as we document in the show, challenged the administration on some of what is going on here. One of the most recent and perhaps most insightful exchanges was with a fellow by the name of Paul Stockton, who's the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security at the Defense Department. And Dan Lundgren in the Homeland Security Committee had him up, I think, in December or so, to talk about, maybe it was earlier this year, he just asked him a basic question. Are we up against radical Islamic extremism? And this guy just wouldn't answer the question. He said, no, sir, we are up against Al-Qaeda. That's it, Al-Qaeda. And I am not going to say we are up. Anyway, that has played out in a number of cases. We had Sue Myrick, who I'm regretful to say is leaving the Congress, but she asked the National Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, in February of last year, about the Muslim Brotherhood, to be told by him that it was a largely secular organization, that it eschewed violence, that had repudiated Al-Qaeda, that was given to humanitarian good works, that didn't have any overarching agenda, at least internationally. Those are quotes. He subsequently had to sort of back away from it because he was so wrong. But the point is, there are people like Sue Myrick, there are people like, I think, Dan Lundgren, there are people certainly like Louis Gohmert. I think Pete King has done some important work in this space. But there need to be more active, full-throated investigations of this topic, as this course makes clear. It's not even begun to be scratched the surface. And we need more members than the ones that I've just mentioned to join them. I hope there will be. Well, I could turn this around and ask how would the Huffington Post treat that, but let me just say that I think that the Muslims themselves, this Islamist leadership, will do to any member of Congress who actually has the temerity to suggest there might even be a problem here, what we saw them do to Pete King last year, when he had a hearing on radicalization in the Muslim community. I mean, quite apart from the theatrics of his colleague Keith Ellison crying over the horrible things that were being done to Muslims, you had the Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the pedigreed Muslim brothers, not on that list because it didn't come into being until 1993, but its predecessor, the Islamic Association of Palestine, is on that list. And actually, we know it's its predecessor because thanks to the Holy Land Foundation trial, the relationship between the founders, one of whom is profiled in our course, Niad Awad, and now runs CARE, and the Islamic Association of Palestine, is back in the day when we used to do this sort of thing, the FBI wiretapped the foundational meeting of CARE by the Islamic Association of Palestine's leaders. My point is this, Andrea, you will find very few people, at least to this point, who have had the courage, let alone the knowledge, to stand up against this civilization jihad. The reason we've done this course at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com is to try to ensure that all of those people who have had the courage so far to stand up are recognized for being the leaders they are, and that more will come to the fore, especially as it is now going to be unmistakably clear between this time and the fall elections, I hope that we're going to see a choice. Do we want more of this kind of submission to Sharia and those who are waging the stealth jihad against us to bring it here, or do we want something different? I pray we will opt for something different because, frankly, the way we're on now is like what has happened already to Europe, and it's not pretty. Again, I would commend to you, the question basically is what's the difference between Sharia, as we've been discussing it under Islam, and halakha, the Jewish law. I mentioned David Yerushalmi, one of our Team B2 members, brilliant lawyer and knowledgeable expert about Sharia and matters of faith. He's an Orthodox Jew. He's done a paper, actually, on the subject that shows numerous differences. And let me just mention two that are most important, I think. One is Sharia requires the destruction of Western civilization and all that otherwise oppose the true faith and its program. That is not the case with Jewish halakha. In fact, to the contrary, as I understand it, I'm not a Jew, but I've been told by David, among others, that this is exactly antithetical to halakha, which makes very clear that it actually requires its adherents to submit to the temporal authorities, let alone trying to overthrow them. It says you will abide by the law of the land. And that's, I think, what they've been doing. So it's complete apples and oranges in my judgment. The question refers to the 2008 Holy Land Foundation trial, in which, in addition to the 5 co-conspirators, there were something like 300 or so, I think, designated unindicted co-conspirators, including many of these Muslim Brotherhood front organizations that were identified as people who were involved in the conspiracy, but for the government's reasons, they were not going to be brought up on charges at that time. The list of those designated unindicted co-conspirators was made public, apparently improperly, but nonetheless was made public, so we know about it. 3 of the top Muslim Brotherhood front organizations in the United States, the one I mentioned, the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, another that I mentioned, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and the one you mentioned, the North American Islamic Trust, took exception to this, found it, I guess bad for business or their reputation, what have you. And they petitioned first the trial judge and then an appeals court panel to be removed from this list of unindicted co-conspirators. On the basis of the evidence that was submitted to the court, the trial judge, who again remonstrated with the prosecution for letting this list be made public, nonetheless found they were, in fact, good candidates or appropriate candidates for identification as unindicted co-conspirators. They appealed it, as I mentioned, and a 3-judge panel confirmed that opinion. All 3 unanimously confirmed that the North American Islamic Trust, which, by the way, owns a substantial percentage, I've heard numbers ranging from 50% to 80% of the mortgages of the mosques in the United States. And one of the other very important points that we make in this course is, for the Islamists, mosques are not simply houses of worship. In their tradition, in their doctrine, they are multi-use facilities, I guess we would call them, including as armories and as training facilities for their battalions. And those are their words, not mine. These are the sorts of things that obviously cause concern about some of these facilities. And the fact that they are owned by an organization that gets its money from the Saudis, which means, of course, along with the money comes the imam, generally speaking, the pedagogy in the madrasas, the books that are sold, the movies that are sold, many of whom, in another study that was done by our colleague David Yerushalmi and one of his colleagues, Mordecai Kedar, published in 2 peer-reviewed journals, found that a sample of 100 of these mosques, 80% of them, Sharia adherent, promoting jihad, and encouraging people to engage in it. That's what comes from having an organization like NATE involved, and why they are indeed, I think, properly described as Muslim Brotherhood front organizations. So answer your final question, why aren't they being prosecuted? Apparently, Eric Holder has decided that we are not going to prosecute any of them. There's a little bit of controversy about this. It's my understanding, it was certainly Pete King's understanding, that the people who prosecuted the first round of Holy Land Foundation conspirators, the Dallas U.S. Attorney's Office, wanted to go to the second round. I think that was the plan all along. You'd get the low-hanging fruit, you'd establish the case, you'd use the evidence effectively against the second group. But Eric Holder has said we're not going to do that. In fact, it seems as though we're not doing much in the way of prosecuting material support for terrorism at all anymore. And I just have to tell you, it kind of goes back to what Andrea was asking about earlier. I just have to tell you that I think if you look at the evidence of the extent to which the Obama-Holder Justice Department, particularly the Civil Rights Division under Thomas Perez, is deeply penetrated, or at the very least deeply sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood and its operations, it shouldn't be a surprise that shutting down criminal prosecutions of some of their front organizations, including ones that Mohammed Majid runs, when Mohammed Majid at Georgetown University Law School, not half a mile from here, jumped up on a stage in October of last year and embraced Mohammed Majid. I mean, doesn't that give rise to a concern that we have got a problem here, Houston? I suggest it does, and that's what this course is designed to help both illuminate and I hope begin to remedy. So thank you especially to our audience listening via live streaming, and to you here as well. And I hope you will check out the various things we've been talking about. We have copies of Sharia, the Threat to America here. You can download them for free at shariathethreat.com. We also have fact sheets, a synopsis of the course at the website, Muslim Brotherhood in America, and the key findings. And I encourage you to take a look at those. And most especially, I really encourage you to take a look at Part 10 of the course, which, if you don't get through anything else, but maybe the overview, will encourage you and give you some really good tools as to what you can do to help. So with that, thank you very much for the Center for Security Policy and our extraordinary team. I appreciate you being here.